His Darkling Creature by Èirgrude Ma, illustrated by Art Gaines. Chapter 5, Descent, Flames and Monsters. Now, you might expect a crash landing to involve a lot of jostling and shaking, but this is not what woke me. It was the alarms that initially burst through the veil of sleep. My conveyance was going down. My heart raced, not unlike how it does when you're trying to attract the attention of the hottest guy at the party and suddenly he locks eyes with you. I don't know how much you know about the technology that powers our conveyances, but this sort of thing is not supposed to be possible. Not like this. It's the sort of thing that only happens in soap operas and the sort of stories they write for little boys. I hope you never experience the kind of fear I felt in that moment. If you had asked me before if I knew what it felt like to fear for my life, I would have confidently replied, yes, with a self-satisfied smile. Any woman who's ever been smiled at by a man she doesn't like knows that feeling. But the moment I realized my reality was unraveling, that I was in free fall, I discovered I didn't know the half of it. Most of us, most women, live with a low hum of anxiety in our lives, the kind that constantly simmers beneath the surface like a pot about to boil over. But this sensation, this was raw, immediate, visceral. My heart lodged itself somewhere in my throat, and my wide eyes bulged in terror as I scanned the control board, a kaleidoscope of blinking lights and chaotic error codes that danced like mocking spirits. I could feel a rushing in my ears and, strangely, in my forehead. The conveyance lurched violently, throwing me against the padded interior. Through the transparent ceiling, I watched the stars wheel around me in a nauseating spiral that made my stomach clench with desperate panic. This wasn't happening to me. This couldn't be happening to me. I was Decima Verdandi. I had 3 advanced degrees, spoke 5 languages at least passably, and possessed a mind sharp enough to cut through the pretensions of lesser mortals. This sort of catastrophic failure was something that happened to other people who weren't as careful or intelligent as I was. But the universe, it seemed, had decided to humble me in the most dramatic way possible. I pressed my hands against the transparent ceiling to steady myself as the conveyance continued its sickening rotation. The planet below swung into view, then disappeared again as we tumbled through space like a child's discarded toy. When it came back into sight, I squinted at the surface, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. At first, I thought it might be Midgard, good old Earth, but from this distance, I should have been able to recognize the familiar continents of the home world that every schoolchild knows. The land masses below were all wrong, all jagged, shaped by geological events of a sort that had never touched Midgard. My mind grasped for other possibilities. Could it be Ernstkohl? I'd visited there once for a delightful weekend getaway, and there was this absolutely divine club overlooking the crystal beaches. For a moment, my heart leaped with hope as I thought I recognized the distinctive crescent shape of the Isle of Mer, where I'd gone sightseeing in an open-topped atmospheric cruiser with a fellow named Pete Wellers, I think. But as the conveyance spun again, I realized my mistake. The Isle of Mer was surrounded by a chain of smaller islands, and what I was seeing below was completely isolated, a lonely smudge of land in an endless ocean. The truth crashed into me with the same inexorable force that was pulling my conveyance toward the planet's surface. I had no idea where I was. The atmospheric entry began with a gentle warming sensation, as if someone had turned up the heat in my apartment just a touch too high. But before too long, that warmth transformed into something altogether more sinister. Through the transparent walls of my conveyance, I watched in horrified fascination as flames began to lick at the exterior hull. The sight was both terrifying and oddly beautiful, like watching a meteor shower from the inside of the meteor. The fire grew more intense, wrapping around my conveyance like the embrace of a violent lover who doesn't know his own strength. The hull groaned and creaked under the stress, and I found myself pressing back into my seat as if I could somehow merge with the cushioning and disappear entirely. Every instinct screamed at me to do something, to take control, to fix this disaster through sheer force of will and intellectual superiority. but there was nothing I could do except watch my carefully ordered world dissolve into chaos. The landscape below resolved into greater detail as we plummeted earthward. Vast stretches of golden desert gave way to jagged mountain ranges that clawed at the sky like the fingers of buried giants. The beauty was savage and unforgiving, nothing like the manicured wildernesses I'd admired from the safety of luxury resorts. This was nature in its rawest form, hostile and indifferent to my plight. I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the darkened control panel, my face pale and wide-eyed, my carefully styled hair now a disheveled mess from the violent tumbling. I did not recognize myself. The terror had drained all the color from my features, making me look younger and more vulnerable than I'd appeared in years. It was almost romantic in a gothic way, like a tragic heroine from one of those brooding novels that always made me cry. Then my conveyance began to shake, and all my melodramatic thoughts vanished. My pumps, which I had removed when I got into the conveyance, started bouncing around the interior of the compartment, and the vibrations hurt my feet. The mountains rushed up to meet me with terrifying speed. I braced myself for the impact that would surely tear my body apart, for the crushing weight of tons of twisted metal and the searing heat of flames consuming everything I was and ever would be. My last coherent thought was a bitter observation about the cosmic injustice of dying alone on some god-forsaken world, when I should have been safe in my own bed, nursing a hangover and planning my next career move. The next thing I knew, the automated crash webbing deployed, enveloping me like a gentle hug from a lover who had just realized I needed him. The webbing shot out from hidden compartments throughout the passenger cabin, a gossamer network of incredibly strong synthetic fibers that expanded to fill every available space. It wrapped around me with surprising tenderness, cradling my body in a cocoon of protective material that reminded me of the ostentatious black and gold silk sheets of Horace's bed, where once I had lain with one of Horace's hands caressing my neck as he managed company business with the other, reading reports and scheduling deliveries. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, being embraced more thoroughly than any man had held me in months, and it was by a machine designed to keep me alive. The impact, when it came, was nothing like what I'd expected. Instead of the bone-crushing violence I'd anticipated, there was a series of jarring bumps and scrapes as the conveyance bounced and rolled down the mountainside. The crash webbing absorbed most of the shock, turning what should have been a fatal collision into something merely terrifying. I felt like a fragile egg protected by an impossibly soft carton, tossed about but somehow remaining intact. Then everything went black. I awakened to the gentle caress of dawn light filtering through the transparent sections of my conveyance. For a moment, I lay there in perfect confusion, wrapped in the now limp crash webbing like a butterfly that had forgotten how to emerge from its chrysalis. My body ached in places I'd never noticed before, and my mouth tasted like I'd been gargling with metal shavings. But I was alive. Gloriously, impossibly alive. The realization hit me with such force that I began to laugh, first a tentative giggle, then a full-throated peal of hysterical laughter. How utterly ridiculous I'd been, working myself into such a state of panic over what was obviously just a minor malfunction. Emergency services were probably already on their way, tracking my conveyance's distress beacon and preparing to whisk me back to civilization where I belonged. I struggled against the crash webbing, pushing it aside with growing irritation. The stuff clung to everything like the desperate embraces of needy ex-boyfriends, and by the time I'd fought my way free, my emerald dress had acquired several new tears, which I craned my head down to examine. Repairable, I thought. I smoothed it down as best I could, grateful that no one was here to witness my disheveled state. The passenger compartment door had been warped in the crash, and I had to work at it for several minutes before I could force it open wide enough to squeeze through. The process required an undignified amount of wriggling and twisting that regrettably left new rips in my dress. By the time I emerged onto the mountainside, I had to rearrange my clothes again. I found a reasonably flat boulder and sank down onto it, taking my first real look at my surroundings. The mountains stretched away in all directions, their peaks painted rose and gold by the rising sun. It was beautiful in a stark, unforgiving way, but completely unfamiliar. No matter how hard I searched the landscape, I couldn't spot any of the landmarks that would have told me which planet I was on. Atten's world, maybe? Èirgrude? No, the sky was the wrong color for Atten's world, and Èirgrude was in the opposite direction to where I'd been headed. It didn't matter. I was sure my location would become clear once the rescue teams arrived. They'd probably be here within 10 minutes, loaded down with medical equipment and hot beverages and more sympathy than I could handle. I tilted my head, listening for the distinctive sirens of approaching emergency vehicles. For a moment, I thought I heard something, a distant wailing that made my heart leap with relief. But as I focused on the sound, it resolved into something altogether different, the cry of some unknown bird echoing off the canyon walls. I tried again, closing my eyes and concentrating, but heard only the whistle of wind through sharp-edged stones. The silence was profound in a way I'd never experienced. I rarely went out into nature like this. I was accustomed to the background hum of technology, the reassuring murmur of 1,000 machines working to make life comfortable and predictable. Here, there was nothing but the alien sounds of an untamed wilderness. It should have been peaceful, but instead it felt ominous, as if the very emptiness were a threat. I am a city girl, after all. I waited about 20 minutes, growing increasingly impatient with each passing moment. Where were they? Surely my conveyance's emergency beacon was broadcasting my location to every rescue service in the sector. I was Decima, not some anonymous nobody who could simply disappear without consequence. People would be looking for me. Important people with connections and resources. Horace and Jinxon and any number of my former boyfriends would probably know what had happened to me within half an hour. Finally, my patience exhausted, I crawled back through the damaged door to check the conveyance's systems. The interior looked like a tornado had swept through it. Loose objects scattered everywhere, panels hanging at odd angles, the crash webbing draped over everything like the remnants of some bizarre party decoration. But the main power core was still functioning, casting a soft blue glow from its housing. I made my way to the control interface, stepping carefully over the debris that littered the floor. The main display screen was dark, its surface spiderwebbed with cracks. I pressed the activation panel, but nothing happened. The screen remained stubbornly black, mocking me with its silence. There had to be manual controls somewhere. I wasn't some helpless damsel who needed a man to operate technology for her. I had an advanced degree in xenolinguistics, for crying out loud. If I could master the grammatical structures of 6 different languages, I could certainly figure out how to work a simple communications array. I found what I was looking for near the floor of the cabin, a small physical interface panel protected by a hinged metal cover. My hands shook slightly as I flipped it open, revealing a series of mechanical switches and buttons that looked like they belonged in a museum. The labels were in Danish, thankfully, though some of the text had been worn away by age or damage. I located the door controls first, managing to get the passenger compartment entrance to open properly with a satisfying pneumatic hiss. At least that was something. But when I tried to access the communications menu, nothing happened. The buttons clicked when I pressed them, but no corresponding lights appeared on the status display. Either the communications array had been damaged in the crash, or we were too far from civilization for the signal to reach anyone who mattered. The implications of this realization began to sink in slowly, like water seeping through a crack in a dam. I might actually be stranded here, at least temporarily, me, Decima, reduced to waiting for rescue like some primitive castaway. The universe clearly had a twisted sense of humor. I sat on one of the cushioned seats of my conveyance, looking out at the alien landscape with growing unease. The sun was climbing higher now, and already I could feel the heat beginning to build. My emerald dress, designed for climate-controlled environments and admiring glances, offered little protection against the harsh realities of outdoor survival. But surely it wouldn't come to that. Surely someone would notice my absence and send a search party. Lyra and Celeste would realize I hadn't come home, wouldn't they? My employer would wonder why I hadn't reported for work. The authorities would trace my conveyance's last known trajectory and what? I realized with growing horror that I'd left the party without telling anyone where I was going. I'd been drunk and emotional, focused only on escaping my own thoughts. For all my friends knew, I might have gone home with some random stranger and decided to spend a few days in passionate abandonment. It could be weeks before anyone thought to look for me. The wind picked up, whistling through the mountain peaks with a sound like distant laughter. My loose hair whipped around my face, and I pushed it back with growing irritation. This was not how my life was supposed to go. I was meant for better things than sitting on a rock in the middle of nowhere, wearing a torn dress and wondering if anyone would notice I was missing. Trying not to think too hard, I undid my hairdo so that it was no longer pulling uncomfortably on my scalp. When that was done, I shook my head and let my hair fall down on my shoulders. Much better. I fumbled through the wreckage until I found the emergency supply compartment, my hands trembling as I pulled out a thermal blanket. The silvery material felt insubstantial between my fingers, like something that belonged in a medical facility rather than the wilderness. But it was better than nothing. The cold was already seeping through my torn dress, making my skin prickle with goosebumps that had nothing to do with fear. Outside, the mountain air bit at my exposed skin with vicious teeth. I wrapped the blanket around my shoulders like a regal cape, trying to maintain some semblance of dignity even as my breath formed little puffs of vapor in the thin atmosphere. The rock I'd claimed as my perch was uncomfortable and cold, but it offered the best vantage point to watch for approaching rescue vehicles. I settled back into my makeshift throne, pulling the blanket tighter around myself. Really, this whole situation was becoming quite intolerable. By now, someone should have noticed the gap in my schedule, the absence of my usual morning correspondence. Surely my employer would wonder why their most valuable analyst hadn't reported for duty and why there was a pileup in the docking arrangements queue. The very idea that I might be forgotten, even temporarily, was ridiculous. I felt embarrassed that the thought had occurred to me. The lawsuit I would bring against the manufacturers of my conveyance would be legendary. I could already envision myself in the courtroom, eloquently describing the trauma I'd endured, the damage to my professional reputation, the sheer negligence that had led to this catastrophe. They'd probably settle out of court for an astronomical sum rather than face the public humiliation of having their safety systems exposed as inadequate. I might even write a book about the experience. Survival and Justice, One Woman's Fight Against Corporate Negligence. I heard whooping in the distance. Finally! I stood up so quickly that the blanket slipped from my shoulders, my relief so profound that I felt lightheaded. Rescue had arrived at last, just as I'd known it would. I was far too important to simply disappear without consequence. "Here!" I called out, waving my arms above my head. "Over here! I'm the crash survivor!" The figures in the distance seemed to notice my frantic gesturing, and I felt a surge of vindication. Of course they'd found me. I was Decima Verdandi, and the universe had a way of setting things right when it came to people like me. I squinted at the approaching group, trying to get a good look at whomever was coming to rescue me. But as they drew closer, confusion began to cloud my relief. Their clothing was all wrong, rough, primitive-looking garments that belonged in a historical recreation rather than a modern rescue operation. And their skin looked green. My first thought was that my rescuers must be partygoers who'd been attending some kind of costume party or themed event when they saw my crash and set out to rescue me. How delightfully eccentric! What a great story this would be. The spears and clubs they carried were very authentic-looking, though. When they approached, I called out to them in relief, my voice echoing off the mountain walls. "Thok se drottningum Valhaller!" I cried out. "Thank the queens of heaven, I've been waiting for hours." The response that came back froze the words in my throat. Harsh, guttural sounds that bore no resemblance to any language I'd ever encountered. Not Danish, English, nor any of the other 5 languages I spoke, not even the archaic dialects I'd studied in graduate school. The tone was aggressive, almost hostile, as if my presence had somehow offended them. I stared at the approaching figures with growing unease. Up close, their appearance was even more disturbing. The green tint wasn't makeup, it was their actual skin color. Their faces were wrong, too, with features that seemed almost human but subtly distorted. Noses set too high, eyes spaced too far apart, expressions that spoke of alien intelligence behind familiar structures. They weren't human. They weren't alien either. In all the years that humanity has been interstellar, we've never encountered aliens who looked vaguely human, even slightly. They're all blobs, insectoids, grub-like or tentacled. These green people were not something I could categorize or understand. Their proportions were wrong, their features twisted into grotesque parodies of humanity. They were trolls or something. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Something was very, very wrong with this entire situation. I screamed. The sound tore from my throat without conscious thought, a primal expression of terror that echoed off the mountain peaks. The green-skinned creatures responded with excited chittering, their alien features twisting into expressions that might have been amusement. They began to move faster, their crude weapons glinting in the sunlight. I turned and ran for my conveyance. Behind me, the creatures gave chase with enthusiastic whoops, as if my terror had transformed this into some kind of game. I threw myself into the passenger compartment, slammed the door, and flicked the manual lock just as the first of my pursuers arrived. If this were a movie or a holonovel, I thought desperately, this would be the moment when the heroine discovered her hidden reserves of strength and courage. She'd burst out of hiding, wrestle a spear from one of these creatures, give them all a good thrashing while delivering clever one-liners, then demand an explanation from them. The audience would smirk and cheer as she proved that intelligence and determination could overcome any obstacle. But I wasn't a movie hero. I was just Decima Verdandi, terrified and trapped and completely out of my depth. Instead of mounting a brave counterattack, I sank down onto the floor of my ruined conveyance and hugged my knees to my chest, making myself as small as possible while the creatures swarmed over the exterior. Their ugly faces pressed against the transparent sections of the canopy, leering down at me with expressions of predatory interest. They reminded me of the holographic monsters at those tacky theme parks my brother used to drag me to when we were children, grotesque caricatures designed to frighten and disturb. But those had been harmless projections, and these things were horribly, undeniably real. The creatures looked like something from old stories. Trolls, perhaps, or Draugr, or Bogarts. One part of my mind tried to catalog their features, to place them in some familiar context, but the terrified animal part of my brain could only cower in fear. They poked at the conveyance with their primitive weapons, testing for weak points like scavengers probing a carcass. I forced myself to stand and approach the control interface, hoping against hope that I could establish some kind of communication link with civilization. But the moment I moved, the creatures began banging on the transparent sections with renewed vigor, their alien faces pressed against the material in leering masks of malevolent glee. I sat back down, my nerve broken. The creatures seemed to take this as a sign of weakness because their assault intensified. They began gathering stones from the mountainside, hefting them experimentally before bringing them down against the canopy with sickening thuds. Each impact sent spiderweb cracks racing across the transparent material, and I realized with growing horror that my shelter wouldn't protect me much longer. Since the green skins had appeared, I'd been feeling something strange inside me. It reminded me of a time when I'd been sick with Valantian fever, and my nanites had acted to preserve my life. The microscopic machines in my bloodstream were reacting to something, their artificial emotions bleeding through into my consciousness like whispers from another dimension. My nanites were alarmed, more than alarmed. They were terrified. Now, you have to understand, this is not something nanites are supposed to be able to do. You hear about it in tabloids now and again, but no one takes those sort of stories seriously any more than when they report that a baby has been born with antlers or the great-great-grandson of Batboy has been spotted again. Nanites are supposed to help you go to sleep and wake up on time and help you get over colds and the flu. That sort of thing. It's not uncommon for people to experience a sense of otherness derived from the nanites under extreme circumstance, but you're not supposed to become aware of their little thoughts and emotions. The banging grew more rhythmic, more organized, as if the creatures had discovered the most effective technique for breaking through. I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to block out the sound of my sanctuary being systematically destroyed. Through the growing network of cracks, I could see their alien faces distorted into expressions of hungry anticipation. Then, with a sound like breaking ice, the canopy finally gave way. Green-skinned hands reached through the gaps, clawing at the edges of the opening to make it wider. I screamed again as they dragged me from the relative safety of my conveyance, their grip rough and possessive. My emerald dress, already damaged from the crash, tore further as they pulled me across the jagged edges of broken, transparent material. The creatures surrounded me, chittering excitedly in their incomprehensible language. Their touch was revolting, skin that felt cold and slightly moist, like something that had been too long in dark, damp places. They poked and prodded at me as if I were some exotic specimen they'd captured for study, their alien features twisted into expressions of cruel curiosity. One of them approached with a club raised above his head, his intention unmistakably violent. This was it, then. This was how Decima Verdandi would meet her end, murdered by primitive monsters on some god-forsaken world, her body left to rot in the wilderness while her killer celebrated with his barbaric companions. That's when the nanites spoke to me. As death approached, I sensed the microscopic machines within me deliberating, trying to overcome some deeply rooted inhibition that would normally prevent them from taking action. They were confused and frustrated at their lack of information. Whatever these green-skinned creatures were, they represented an existential threat. Not to me, but to themselves, the entire race of nanites. What that could mean, I wouldn't be able to tell you. Impossibly, the little machines began to communicate with me directly. Not in words, they had no capacity for language as humans understood it, but in pure impressions, simple images that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to some deeper part of my mind. I saw my hand reaching out, felt their urgent need for contact, understood without understanding that I had to touch the creature threatening me. I stretched forth my hand as if in a trance, my fingers making contact with the green-skinned monster's leg. It was the only part of him I could reach, sprawled as I was upon the ground. The effect was immediate and devastating. His eyes went wide, the pupils dilating until they nearly consumed the alien irises. Blood vessels burst in the whites of his eyes, turning them crimson as his body convulsed once, twice, then went completely still. He fell straight downward in a heap, and I felt the nanite's triumph wash through me like a drug. The other greenskins backed away from me, chattering in their harsh language. Some pointed at me with obvious fear, others at their fallen comrade. But I barely noticed their reaction because darkness was creeping in at the edges of my vision. The nanites had used me somehow, channeled through me, and the effort had drained something vital from my very core. I felt myself falling, consciousness slipping away like water through my fingers. I came back to consciousness slowly, awareness filtering through layers of discomfort and confusion. My arms ached terribly, stretched above my head and secured with rough ropes that bit into my wrists. I was tied to a stone wall in what appeared to be a natural cave, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something organic and unpleasant that I didn't want to identify. My emerald dress hung in tatters around my body, the expensive fabric reduced to strips. The creatures had been rough in their handling of me, and I shuddered to think what else they might have done while I was unconscious. But I seemed to be intact, if thoroughly disheveled and more frightened than I'd ever been in my life. A movement in the shadows caught my attention, and I turned my head to see another figure crouched nearby. At first glance, of course, I thought it must be one of those green-skinned things, but as my eyes focused, I realized this was something else. His hair was light, no, pure white, not the gray white of age, but a luminous platinum that seemed to catch and reflect what little light filtered into our prison from fissures in the ceiling and a nearby campfire with a strange mound beside it. His eyes were equally striking, pale irises that might have had the slightest tinge of blue or gray, set in a face that was undeniably human, and a striking specimen of one at that. His face was close to mine, and he was staring at me with a wild, wide-eyed intensity that I could only interpret as predatory in nature. Incredibly, his hand, which he held close to my face, was emitting light from the palm. He seemed to be examining me. His eyes were hungrily devouring the contours of my face. Of course, this was so alarming that I immediately drew in a breath to scream. But before I could make a sound, he lunged forward with startling speed and cupped one hand around the back of my head and pressed the other firmly over my mouth. His wild, staring eyes glared into mine from only inches away.